It's now finally time to introduce the two great actors in the drama that is about to unfold, and we'll check in with both of them in the year 1502. The first of these characters is the most wealthy and powerful man in the world, at least as far as he knows. He is the king of the Aztecs, a man named Moctezuma II, and the year 1502 was the year of his coronation. Like most Moshika of his time, Moctezuma had dark, wavy hair and was of average height. He had an aquiline nose and a large forehead. People who knew him recall that his voice was eloquent, courteous, and diplomatic, but he spoke with a kind of quiet force. Some say that he spoke so quietly that the movements of his lips could barely be seen. Moctezuma was 35 years old. He was the ninth king of Tenochtitlan, coming to power when the empire was at the height of its confidence. The people of the capital must have had high hopes that he would carry their young empire to even greater glory. A Moshika coronation was a drawn-out and splendid affair. Moctezuma first went into spiritual retreat for a few days, fasting and praying in the temples. Once that was done, there would have been a raucous ceremony, with music, dancing, festivals, feasts, and the arrival of visiting the ability from all over the Aztecs' lands. After the coronation, it was traditional to go to war and bring back captives to be sacrificed. For this purpose, Moctezuma crushed a number of rebellions across the empire and brought many captives back to Tenochtitlan. The blood would have run down the steps of the temple for days. Moctezuma would have overseen these sacrifices, wearing a headdress made of shimmering green Quetzal feathers, and we can imagine the cheering of the crowds. As the new emperor raised his hands and all the lands of the Aztecs bowed down beneath him, the second actor in this drama couldn't have been more different. To find him, we will have to travel nearly 9,000 kilometers to the east across the wide expanse of the ocean. Eventually, we reach the limestone cliffs of Europe and fly over forests of cypresses and pines until we land in the small village of Medellin in Inning. Medellin sits on the river Guadiana, dotted with conifers and olive trees, with the imposing shape of a 10th century castle sitting on a rocky outcrop over the village. Its houses are painted white with terracotta tiles, and in one of these houses, a 17-year-old boy is sitting alone and studying. He has a sickly, pale look about him. In fact, as a child, he was so frail that his parents expected him to die of sickness on several occasions. At the age of 14, he had been sent to study Latin with an uncle in the city of Salamanca, and his parents had hoped this would set him up for a legal career. But the boy hated his time there, and after 2 years he returned home, much to the disappointment of his parents. Now it's 1502. On the other side of the ocean, the Emperor Moctezuma is climbing that tall pyramid to be crowned, and this teenager is stuck in his small Spanish home town. The monotony of his life makes him irritable and unpleasant. As the 16th century Spanish historian Historica López de Gamada recalls, he was a source of trouble to his parents as well as to himself, for he was restless, haughty, mischievous, and given to quarrelling. This boy's name was Hernando Cortés, known to his friends as Hidanan. If you looked in his eyes at the age of 17, you may not have imagined what lay in this boy's future, but perhaps you would have seen a little flicker in the center of those eyes. And if you looked closer, it may have looked like the fluttering of flames. Cortés was a member of a class known as the Hidalgos. They had noble ancestry, but didn't own any land, and with little by way of inheritance. Being the son of a Hidalgo wasn't the most envious position. As Cortés approached the age of 18, he knew what path awaited him. He wanted to go to fight in Italy, where a number of wars were raging, and where there would always be demand for mercenaries. But the closer that day approached, the more he began to hear of discoveries that were happening on the other side of the world. In this work, he suggested that the lands discovered by Columbus were not the age of Asia, as had previously been thought, but an entirely new landmass. The relatively new technology of the printing press had eddied this idea around all of Europe and beyond. A frenzy for exploration had begun. Since then, stories had begun to flow back to Europe about the opportunity that might await on the other side of the sea. Veritable mountains of gold. The more Cortés heard these stories, the more he lost his previous enthusiasm for Italy. He soon made up his mind, as recalled by the historian de Gomara. He considered which of the two routes would suit him best, and decided to cross over to the Indies, because it seemed to him a more profitable journey than the ones in Naples, on account of the great quantity of gold which had come from there. Cortés rallied around the port town of Valencia for 2 years. He loved to gamble, a habit that never left him. But despite this voice and others, he soon had enough money to buy passage on a ship across the Atlantic. He finally set sail in the year Fefdeval, at the age of 19. Cortés wrote down no account of his roughly 2-month journey across the sea, but one Dominican friar who wrote down his experience some years later gives us some sense of what it must have been like. The ship is a very strong and narrow prison from which no one can flee. The heat, the stuffiness and the sense of confinement are sometimes overpowering. The bed is ordinarily the floor. Most passengers go about as if out of their mind or in poor health. There is a terrible smell, especially below deck. It must have been a relief when he finally landed on the island of Hispaniola, which is today divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This was the island where Columbus had first landed in the New World, and where the first European settlements in the Americas began. Christopher Columbus actually went to his grave insisting that he had not discovered a new continent, an ironic detail considering this is the achievement we all remember him for. His goal had been to reach the east coast of Asia, and he never admitted that he had failed. The scale of his use of slave labor was shocking, even for those at the time, and Ansusabenen and his 200,000 indigenous people were killed under his regime, which ruled with terror and sadistic punishments over the native people. To save the faint of heart, I won't go into details here, but the cruelty of Columbus's regime would have made even most Aztec kings look benign by comparison. In the year 1500, the rumors of Columbus's brutality became too much for the Spanish king, who had him removed from power. But the situation hardly improved for Hispaniola's native Evan, and in 1513, the first African slaves were imported to make up the devastated population of the island. Hispaniola set the pattern for what the European settlement of the New World would look like. It was a steamroller that ruptured all other forms of life beneath it, and this was a pattern that would be repeated countless times over the coming centuries. We don't know what Cortés thought of Hispaniola when he got there. At the age of 18, he registered as a citizen, which meant he was given a plot of land to build a house and farm on, complete with a staff of enslaved locals. Since he had a couple of years' legal training, he was given a job as a notary in a small town for the next 6 years. He witnessed legal documents and learned the ins and outs of law right there at the age of a known world. But that same boredom he'd felt as a child began to creep over him, and in 1511 he gave in to the Velázquez, 20 years older than Cortés, and already a powerful man in the New World, planned to lead an expedition to conquer the neighboring island of Cuba and repeat there what they had done in Hispaniola. Everything gained as it did from all such expeditions. When the invasion of Cuba was complete, Velázquez was sufficiently impressed with Cortés's legal skill that he appointed him his personal secretary. In Cuba, they set up the settlement of Santiago, and Cortés was appointed its municipal magistrate. As a reward, Velasquez gifted him a large estate, including gold mines and even more enslaved people to work for him. Cortez's power grew, and it's clear that soon Governor Velasquez viewed him as a potential rival. Around this time, Cortez grew his beard, thickened, and to dress like a king, wearing an extravagant hat with a large plumed feather, a medallion of gold, and a black velvet cloak. But no matter how much wealth he amassed, Cortez was never satisfied. Once again that boredom set in, and he began looking over the horizon and wondering what else might be out there. His answer came in the following years, as a number of expeditions began making further advances to the mainland of the Americas itself. In 1517, an expedition led by Juan Francisco Hernández de Córdoba explored the coast of Mexico for the first time. They met Mayan people living here on the north coast of the Yucatan Peninsula and were impressed by their Cuba. But the expedition was ill-fated. The Spaniards repeatedly ran out of water, and the Mayans, perhaps initially impressed at their guns and steel armor, quickly realized that this small group could be easily overwhelmed. They were attacked, and 50 Spaniards were killed, with the expedition leader later dying of his wounds. At this time, no one was really sure what this landmass was. Most believed it was just another large island, while others continued to maintain that it was the mainland of Asia. All they knew was that a long coast stretched out on either side with an unknown amount of land behind it. The unlucky Cordoba expedition was followed a year later in 1518 by another, led by the Spaniard Juan de Grijalva. This time, the Spanish took greater protection. They armed their ships with small cannons called culverins, capable of shooting a 10-kilogram cannonball around 400 meters. Cortés doesn't seem to have paid much attention to these expeditions, perhaps occupied with his work in Cuba. But when Juan de Grijalva failed to return from his voyage, rumors and worries began to spread. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, put together a search and rescue party. With the whatever reason, Cortés was chosen to lead this expedition. He wasn't the most obvious choice for it. He was relatively young, only 33 years old, and he had never led an army or commanded any kind of military post. I think it's possible Velázquez hoped that Cortés would be killed on this expedition. It might have seemed like an excellent way to get rid of this ambitious upstart. But despite his military inexperience, Cortés was a good diplomat and clearly had a way with words. In just 1 month he had convinced 300 men to follow him and put together 6 ships ready for this mission to the New World. There was only one problem. Before they could set off, Juan de Grijalva, the lost Spaniard who they were setting out to find, sailed back into port. He had been delayed while exploring the coast of Mexico, but he brought back some incredible stories. He had seen cities built with tall pyramids and streets paved with stone, and he had met a delegation from a powerful king who was said to live there and to call himself Moctezuma. Despite these enticing stories, this must have taken the wind out of Cortés's sails. He now had a fully funded search party for someone who was known missing, and for Governor Velázquez, this was enough of a reason to pull his support for the voyage. If Grijalva had come back, perhaps it wasn't so dangerous over there at all, and the last thing he wanted was for Cortés to get the glory that came with making new discoveries. But that restless, mischievous boy had never really left Cortés, and perhaps his old love of gambling also played a part. He decided that he would go ahead with the mission anyway, that he would sail to this new land against the wishes of the governor and discover the truth about this king across the water. Cortés gave the order to depart as soon as possible before Governor Velázquez could stop him. Velázquez had been supplying all the food for the journey, and so Zo would depart with no supplies, but they set sail anyway, departing from Santiago on November the 18th, 1518. According to some sources, the governor heard of Cortés's plan at the last moment and hurried down to the dock to find his 6 ships already pulling away from port. He's said to have called out to him, "Why can't he? Is this the way you leave? Is this a fine way to say farewell to me?" On hearing this, Cortés called back this famous reply, "Who yet made your worship for this and similar things have to be done, rather than thought about?" Velázquez watched as Cortés and his men set sail, but he knew they wouldn't get far. They were still drastically short on food. They sailed around the coast of Cuba for weeks, but everywhere they went, found that Governor Velázquez had already sent orders ahead of them, telling the people of Cuba not to give any supplies to this rogue expedition, but enough people were willing to barter with them. They brought up loaves of cassava bread, beef and pork pickled in brine, salt, fish and salted biscuits, along with some live chickens. They even ran into 200 men who had been on Juan Grijalva's expedition, and some exhorted others who all agreed to join them. Their numbers swelled to around 630 men, and their number of ships to 11. They brought along 13 horses which they hoisted onto the ships with a pulley and kept on deck throughout the crossing. They also brought several cannons, those same light culverins that the Grijalva mission had used. They also brought dogs, large powerful mastiffs that had been used on European battlefields for centuries. Among the men were 30 crossbowmen and 12 who carried arquebuses, an early form of musket. After weeks of going from port to port, they had enough to make the voyage across the sapphire blue waters. The invasion of Mexico had begun. Some of the main sources we have for what happens next are the so-called Cartas of Cortés. These are the letters that he wrote throughout his expedition and sent back to King Charles V of Spain, sent to His Sacred Majesty the Emperor, our sovereign by Don Fernando Cortés, Captain General, a New Spain, in which he gives an account of the thefts and provinces without number that he has newly discovered in Yucatan. The letters are remarkable for a number of reasons. For one thing, they're the only set of documents that we know were written at the time of the invasion by someone who was definitely there, and they also have a remarkable literary ambition full of detail and colour. But of course they also have their problems as historical sources. Cortés was not classically educated, and he wouldn't have been familiar with the epics of Greek and Latin, but he did enjoy reading the romances that were popular in Spain at the time. Tales of daring by adventurous knights fighting against foreign enemies, and then there's something of that feeling to these documents. Cortés always cast himself in the best possible light in these letters, but his years as a notary and treasurer's clerk had also made him well versed in Spanish law. This meant that all of his accounts cast him in the best possible legal light, with the two usually taking pains to show that he had done everything exactly according to the law. For this reason, his letters have to be read very carefully, and with an acknowledgement that their relationship to the truth is often quite strained. On the Spanish side, we also have the memoirs of two of the soldiers who followed Cortés on his expedition, who wrote down their memories in the 1560s as they reached old age. One of them, Francisco de Aguilar, renounced earthly wealth and retired to a Dominican monastery, while the other Bernal Diaz del Castillo became a landholder in Guatemala. Both are similarly flattering accounts of the expedition's heroics, and are also confused by the more than 40 years that had passed since the events. One remarkable account of those years. This is known as Book 12, and it compiles the memories of the Mexica people, survived like Bernal Diaz, and to Aguilar. They are looking back from a distance of several decades. This means that many details are questionable, and things like the exact words of speeches given by Moctezuma and Cortés are likely not entirely reliable. But this book, 12 of the Florentine Codex, is an incredible source for how the Mexica people remembered their experience of those years and the fall of their civilization. The expedition of Juan de Grijalva in the previous year had caused quite a stir. In the court of the Aztec king, Moctezuma, lookouts guarding the coast had sighted the tall ships of the Spanish in the distance. These Mexica people would have seen the tall white sails emblazoned with Spanish crosses and must have known that they were looking at something they had never seen before. The Mexica people are often portrayed as reacting with fear or disbelief at the sight of the Europeans, but we should be a little careful about these accounts. Europeans delighted in sharing stories of how the fearful Aztecs believed their ships to be floating mountains or cities moving about on the waves. People in Europe especially loved stories of how the Aztecs believed the Europeans to be a kind of god, and the soldier Bernardillas, writing 40 years later, embellished his stories with the idea that the Aztecs believed Cortés to be the return of the god Quetzalcoatl. Over time, these stories became more and more specific, adding in details like the fact that Quetzalcoatl was supposed to have pale skin. But honestly, there's no evidence that the Mexica ever thought that the Europeans were gods, and these stories are likely later inventions. If the Mexica ever did believe something of this sort, they quickly dispensed with the idea. They must have been astonished at the first sight of Spanish ships, and with their armor, their guns, and their horses. But they quickly assessed the reality of the situation, that these were men from a different place, whose ships were larger and whose weapons were more powerful than their own. And as their contact with the Europeans went on, it's clear that they began to see them not as a kind of god, but as a kind of devil. At the sight of those tall white sails of the coast, the Mexica watchmen immediately paddled out on their canoes to investigate. They made a traditional sign of respect as they reached the Spanish ships, mimicking kissing the ground, and the Spanish called out to them as the Florentine Codex recalls. Then they embarked, launched off, and went out on the water. The water folk paddled for them. When they approached the Spanish, they made the earth-eating gesture at the power of the boat. The Spaniards called to them, "Who are you? Where have you come from? Where is your homeland?" Immediately they said, "It is from Mexico that we have come." They answered them back, "If you are really Mexica, what is the name of the ruler of Mexico?" They told them, "Oh, our lords, Moctezuma is his name." The Mexica brought with them a collection of fine textiles as gifts, which they gave to the Spanish sailors. In return, the Spanish gave them some beaded jewelry, which the Mexica received, politely but would not have been particularly impressed by.